quantum computing and why you should care. Why that's a real thing. It's not just in Star Trek anymore. And how does that affect us today, specifically in the world of cryptography? So quantum computing and security. My name is still Andrew Stubers, for those of you who attended this morning's Tech Talks. Still here with Sunset Learning Institute, and we're just presenting on topics that are interesting or topics we feel you should be aware of, but there's no official training on yet. So, big idea with this session, kind of got started on this already. What is quantum computing? Let's dive a little bit into how it works. What is it really when folks say quantum computing, and what are some of the challenges it presents, and then what are some of the solutions? For this whole lesson, this is targeted toward the network engineer, the network analyst, who is responsible for more of the security side of things. All right, compliance, audit checks, where we're making sure that we are using sufficient levels of encryption to protect ourselves against quantum attacks or quantum cracking. So we're going to go through, what are we going to go over? We're going to go over quantum computing. We're going to go over some recommendations from your wonderful friend, your neighborhood-friendly NIST and NSA and the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force. They've got a couple recommendations for you for how you can still trust your network, even though quantum computing is a threat. So we'll start with, what is it? We'll move into the timeline. I want to take a look, just pretty quickly, it's just 4 or 5 slides, about the development timeline of quantum computing. When did it start and where are we today? And then we're going to take a look at probably the most critical piece, Shor's algorithm. Peter Shor, his algorithm, just going to get ahead of myself real quick. That is a quantum algorithm for factoring large numbers quickly. All right, and that is the scary part of today, all right, because that's the tool, that's the algorithm that allows quantum cryptography to come against, or I should say quantum computing to come against our cryptography. All right, and then we'll finish up with the recommendations. We do have plans, we do have options for staying secure today. So first off, what is quantum computing? So we're all familiar with what's called, or most of us are familiar with what's called classical computing. I'm trying not to stand for my slide here. Classical computing, you've got discrete memory, and you can call it RAM, random access memory, but we measure data with bits, your binary bits, ones and zeros, and when data is written to memory, data that we're going to process, data we're going to manipulate, a unit of memory is either a 1 or a 0. It's given a set value, it's locked in, and that's the value that it's holding. So we also use a lot of electrical signals to indicate changing values, 1 and 0, what we want to write to that memory, we want to read that memory, what's its current value. So when we start dealing with quantum mechanics, quantum states, there's the concept of a superposition, or quantum superposition. So that a given particle can be either a particle or its state can be in a state of flux depending upon how much energy is passing through it. Now, that superposition, that state of flux, it has the ability to be in either state at any given moment, but there's this trade-off of the quantum state versus the classical state. The act of measuring a quantum particle, the act of measuring it, in the moment of being measured, this is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, the act of measuring something affects it. So when we measure its state in that moment, it only has one state, but theoretically it could be any. So that's part of, this is not at all everything, but that's part of what goes into the quantum memory having potential states, these superpositions. So we start looking at what's called qubits, or quantum bits, being used to hold these memory units. And we're not assigning discrete values of 1 or 0. We're looking at using the measurement of those particles and their superposition states to potentially calculate much more quickly or in a different method. It's not always more quickly, just a different method of calculating than using just classical binary ones and zeros, okay? Now, some of the problems that we run into for using particles and their states for their calculations, so I'll just go back to high school physics, high school chemistry, all right? Energy and atoms, energy and particles, we know that just the different electrons, the neutrons, that more heat, more energy, the act of observing can change their state. It can affect the electron flow. So what we were worried about, there's a couple problems, is what's called decoherence or noise. I'm gonna talk about this in a little bit. But one of the ways we minimize decoherence and noise is superconducting material. We start looking at extremely cold temperatures for processing to minimize variables. All right, this is why you don't have a supercomputer, or not supercomputer, this is why you don't have a quantum computer in every single house. So today, maybe not in the future, but today, just the hardware, just the materials necessary to achieve quantum calculations, it's a little cost prohibitive. All right, but with some of the tools that they're using today are optical traps and ion traps in order to capture particles, in order to capture ions. Sometimes they're using even magnetic traps to trap ions in order to measure, they use those for measuring the states. We're manipulating waves, most of the time light waves these days. It started off with magnetic waves, now it's light waves. There's a bunch of different generations of quantum computing in order to measure those trapped particles using the measurements within quantum formulas to achieve a calculation. So kind of interesting from just like a layer one physical perspective. It's not just electrical signal 1 or 0, trapped particles being measured with waves. Sorry, I feel like I'm gonna sneeze here. Anyway, so quantum computers, they have the ability, layer one, they've got the hardware for trapping the particles, using the wave measurement, they're running the quantum algorithms, but they have the ability to measure those qubits, measure the state of those particles, retrieve that data, and then transition back to the quantum state. So when we measure that, we would say it is a classical measurement. It's no longer in a superposition, it's a measured state. We have the data, we have the calculation. So you and I, our programs, our output, we need a finite value. So we need to measure that. It's just the superposition gives us the ability to potentially process thousands of calculations more per second than your regular processors. So just do a quick little visualization here. Classic memory, classic RAM, you've got all your gigabytes of RAM, 16, 32, 64 bytes of RAM, gigabytes of RAM, and that's how this total storage, and all that storage can be broken down to how many bits. And each of those bits is either a 0 or a 1. But when we look at a qubit, when we look at a quantum bit, the block sphere is what's traditionally used to represent that, to represent the potential superposition. It's kind of a nice little graphical image. Thank you, Wikipedia, for providing that. So when you look at the hardware, sometimes the hardware can even look like regular chips, but it's not just ones or zeros anymore. At least from our human perspective. If you get down to a microscopic level, you get the different hardware types. So, some of the problems. Why is it taking so long? Why is quantum computing really, is it still relegated to the world of science fiction? Okay, why is it that when I talk about presenting on this, folks say, really? That's a thing? One of the huge problems that we've had, scientists around the world, is quantum decoherence. Okay, we're dealing with energy, we're dealing with particles and measured particles. So in a perfect environment, to have a consistent state of that particle, it would be an isolated experiment, an isolated qubit. The problem is, if it's isolated, you can't measure it. You can't pass waves through it to determine its state. So you could either have a perfect qubit, which never loses its coherence, it never changes state, but you're never able to measure that state. So the act of providing a measurable environment means that it is going to be interacting with the physical environment. Think of it like a room in your house, okay? Think of it like a room. And that room is, we'll say 75 degrees, random temperature. So if that room is 75 degrees, but every other room around that is 80 degrees, we would say there's some decoherence there. That room, it has its temperature, but it's being affected by the other rooms, whether those doors are open or not, whether you can see into that room, the temperatures affect each other. So that's one of the problems, that's why you see a lot of the superconducting metals and superconducting, some of the light-based measurement, that's to minimize the potential interference. Then there's just noise. Quantum noise, usually temperature differences. When you start looking at the hardware itself, the container, the qubit material, again, going to using superconducting, just the act of quantum processing itself generates noise, which can lead to discrepancies in the calculations. One of the huge problems with early quantum computing, quantum calculations, was yes, there's a qubit, yes, there's a particle, yes, we're measuring it, but there was so much decoherence. It was not in a coherent state. There was so much decoherence that it was totally random. Yes, it was quantum, but it really generated no useful data. So some of the initial advancements in quantum computing was really about just achieving coherence. Not even running massive programs or trying to run Shor's algorithm. Some of the earliest generations of quantum computing is just make it coherent, make it stable, so that we can actually run programs, right? Run algorithms. So there's a whole field called quantum error correction, QEC, which is different methods, and there's been advancements year over year in this, ways to make quantum computing more stable so we can run more complex algorithms, run not quite full programs yet, but at least algorithms on these computers. So some of the ways we achieve quantum error correction, definitely environmental. I mentioned this a couple of times now. Superconducting metals, super cooled environments. Because if it's a lot of it's energy based, minimizing energy differences can minimize the decoherence, minimize the noise that's being generated. Part of it's also just programming. So what a quantum engineer will do is they'll load the same data, the same formula, into 3 different qubits. And then they'll run their measurements against that. And if 2 out of 3 qubits return the same result, but the third one's different, kind of gives you a hint. That might be an outlier, okay? Or they'll do against 4 or 5, multiple qubits at a time. So allowing for that the probability, the possibility of an outlier, of an off measurement, they're able to remove those extra measurements and then have the returned result, what's left, be used in their calculation. So part of it's just not quite trial and error, but doing excessive testing, excessive measurements, and then taking the average there. And there's also something called syndrome measurement, where not measuring the particle itself, the act of measuring the particle, reducing it from its quantum to a classical state, that is retrieving the information. But instead of measuring the particle, syndrome measurement involves measuring the qubit itself, measuring and looking at charge levels, looking at state levels, determining if a potential error has occurred, comparing a qubit state to a qubit next to it. I mean, are they the same? And if a state change has occurred, reversing that state change, undoing the error, if you will, before going and measuring the particle itself. So that's kind of interesting, where we can measure. I say we; these are not myself. Other engineers, they can measure if an error has occurred and undo that before proceeding with the calculation. So taking all that together, some of the earliest coherent states were 2 seconds. And then we get to 15 seconds, then you get to 2 hours, then you get to multiple hours of a coherent environment where you can run algorithms, quantum algorithms again and again and again, on that hardware, but it took a lot. It took multiple years, and I'll show you this in a second, multiple years to get to this state, dealing with all these problems, having these solutions, where quantum computing really became a reality. So, what's the timeline? How long did it take us to get here? Quantum computing was theorized, was put forth way back in the 1960s. All right, so remember 1960, you know, we still had before the internet really kicked off, dial-up internet, mass dial-up internet, before even that was really around, quantum computing has been proposed from almost the same timeline. But it took until about 1980 for Paul Benioff to come up with the first theoretical models. Okay, we always have to have the theoretical model, then we can get to the practical, we can start doing testing. So 1985, there were some more descriptions of the universal quantum computer. 1992 was one of the first, the Deutsche Jotset algorithm, apologize if I said that wrong. That was one of the first theoretical, didn't have one yet, quantum algorithms. And with this algorithm, it was designed so that in a theoretical quantum computer, this algorithm would be able to be processed, but it was unable to be run on classical, just regular binary hardware. And in 1994, Peter Shor came up with Shor's algorithm for factoring large numbers quickly, extremely quickly, relative to classical computers. That same year, the United States government started working on quantum computing. Why is this a big thing? Because the cryptography that we use today, RSA keys, your Rivest, Schumacher, Edelman keys, Diffie-Hellman, the elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman, AES, the advanced encryption standards. A lot of the encryption tools that we use today are calculated, those keys, those algorithms, they calculate using factored numbers, using large keys, large amounts of encryption, with the bet, it's a pretty good bet till today, that an attacker, someone who's trying to read your traffic, they can't de-encrypt your traffic quickly to determine what your keys are. It's not computationally possible, or within a short amount of time. But when this algorithm was created, it was posited, and it's theoretical, that you could factor those keys, factor the encryption keys quickly, so that an eavesdropper, someone capturing your traffic, wouldn't take them 2 years, it wouldn't take them 2,000 years, it might take them a couple minutes, and they can crack your traffic because they can crack the keys being used in the encryption. So that was kind of a, kind of moment for everybody where they said, oh yeah, quantum computing is kind of interesting. No, quantum computing can be very scary, depending upon how we're using this. So immediately, not just the United States government, other governments as well, 1994 is when the US government officially started working. Kind of a history lesson, very next year, 1995, the Department of Defense created their own workshop. They've been working with IBM as well, a lot on that. Quantum error correction, that whole field started to be developed in the same year, 1995. We had the Lost DiVincenzo quantum computer was proposed, and in 1998, a couple years ago, a working 2-qubit quantum computer was created. There was a second one at IBM in the same year. They were kind of duplicating the research between the two universities. Same year, later on in the year, a 3-qubit machine is created. So it's not theoretical. It is a full world of computer science, quantum computing, quantum programming, quantum algorithms. IBM, if you go check out some of their websites, they've got a whole quantum developers line where they're looking for interns wanting to become quantum programmers. All right, because since 1998, we've had working qubit machines. Now, some of these earlier machines, a lot of these were based off of what's called NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. Okay, so a lot working more from a magnetic perspective, whereas today we use a lot of optical, a lot of light waves for the measurements. So a little difference in hardware, a lot of hardware enhancements, but can't stress that enough, since 1998. The quantum no deletion theorem was proved back in 2000. This kind of critical there. the quantum no deletion theorem posits that data in a qubit, quantum data, cannot be created or destroyed. All right. It means, what does this have to do with? It means you can't just arbitrarily remove information from a qubit. It can't just theoretically disappear. When we're doing our calculations, we can rely on that if there's a particle there, it's being measured. Yes, there's like the quantum, the superposition states. You don't have to worry about one of those positions or the measurement, suddenly the data's gone. All right, so there's the no deletion theorem. There's also the no cloning theorem, where you cannot copy the information. You cannot have a perfect clone of one qubit's information in another. You can spread the information from one qubit to another, but you cannot clone it to the other. So again, for eavesdropping, stealing information, you don't have to worry about that. So pretty critical, just kind of background theorems for how the processing works. 2000, 5-qubit machine, say later on in the year, 7-qubit machine. More 2001 was measurement-based quantum computing. 2002 through 2004, whole host of hardware enhancements, processing enhancements, software enhancements. 2005, we had the first qubit, the quantum byte out in Austria. 2006, a 12-qubit. You can see how things are getting just a little bit faster here. As soon as the United States government, DoD, get involved, you get some massive funding, international groups, start to see some pretty quick leaps there. 2007, 2008, more hardware enhancements, and in late 2008, D-Wave systems. D-Wave systems. They're kind of, their tagline is they call themselves the quantum computing company. They created a 128 qubit chip. Not a whole system, just a chip with 128 qubits in it. So the idea is that you could use classical computing hardware to create instructions and run programs, which could then be converted to quantum hardware and run on the quantum processing. So we'll start to see more of it, that blending of quantum and classical hardware, where depending upon what algorithm you're running, depending upon what's the software, some of it's written to run on classical computing, some of it's written to run on quantum computing. So since 2008, over a decade ago, we've had 128-bit chips, quantum chips. Last part here, 2009, the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, they read and wrote to individual qubits, the ability to not just have a whole process, a whole algorithm running on every qubit address, but individual qubits being assigned at a time. So think of that kind of like individual memory blocks in classical computing being read and written to. Kind of critical. Your first programmable quantum computer was built back in 2009, over a decade ago. All right, the next 4 years, just more enhancements, more research, a couple more increments of hardware. 2015, D-Wave had a 1,000 qubit system, kind of critical there. And then 2016, just a couple of years ago, Shor's algorithm. Remember Shor? The algorithm for factoring large numbers quickly was deployed in a quantum computer. All right, the algorithm that can theoretically break our current encryption was actually used in a quantum computer. Right, it's real. That was 3 years ago. 2 years ago, Google had their own 72-qubit chip. Even Google is building, it's not just this little dedicated company, even Google is building quantum chips now. And this year, IBM had their Q System 1. It's a commercially available quantum computer. Now, it's very cost prohibitive, you probably can't buy it. But the idea is that it is from IBM, it's gonna, you'll see the price going down over the next probably decade. But the concept for big data, cloud processing, any places where quantum computing can provide us leaps and bounds, we're there. We have commercially available quantum computers. It's just not everyone can afford them yet. Now, back to 2016. Is all your encryption broken today? No. Okay, what they are still working on is getting Shor's algorithm to run large numbers. Because remember, when we talk about our encryption keys, we talk about like 2,000-bit keys, 3,000-bit keys. And so with Shor's algorithm, they've run that on smaller numbers, and it's worked there. But it has not quite been proven yet publicly that Shor's algorithm has broken current key size and will be used for encryption. So we know Shor's algorithm works. We know it's running on quantum hardware, all right, but it's not broken yet. Now, one of the things I left off here, you guys remember that guy named Edward Snowden? Whether you have positive or negative feelings about him for what he did release a lot of documents. And in those documents, we learned that back in 2004, so if we roll back here a little bit, way back in 2004, the NSA also officially announced, or internally, not officially to the world, internally started looking into quantum computing. And so we had no idea they were doing that until Snowden released those papers just a couple of years ago. So this is the public timeline of where we are from a quantum computing perspective. And even the public timeline is quantum computing exists. We have quantum hardware. From an unofficial timeline perspective, yes, they're out there. There's probably a quantum computer running Shor's algorithm on today's encryption. Okay, so big thing you take away from this, it's not theoretical, it's not just in Star Trek, quantum computing is real, and there's hardware for it. So, it's not just Shor's algorithm, by the way. There's also GECM, the quantum elliptic curve factorization method. There's multiple algorithms today which are designed for looking at, you might see that elliptic curve, elliptical curve cryptography is what we use today. There are multiple algorithms designed to not attack cryptography, but to be for factoring numbers, for factoring quantum elliptic curves, so those could be used against the elliptic curve, against the cryptographic keys we use today. So a couple of years ago, there were some researchers, I can't remember exactly which university they were at, who were looking at the timing. How long would it take for classical computers to crack today's keys? So they looked at some RSA keys, the Reves Shamir, which is one of the most popular keys in use when you look at public key cryptography and web encryption, email encryption. RSA is pretty popular out there. So small keys are pretty weak. All right, even for classical computers, a small key, 512-bit, 768-bit keys, those can be cracked. Those can be factored even using classical computing. Supercomputers have been around for several years, and those nation states have them. Universities have them. Universities associated with nation states have those. So those we don't like. But large keys, okay, 1024, 2048-bit keys, those are not impossible to crack. Everything can be cracked. It's just a matter of how much calculation is required to do that. So it was estimated that it would take around 2,000 years to factor a 1024-bit RSA key, RSA modules, 1024-bit RSA key. So that's classical computing. So that's why we say, we're okay with that, because it's going to take so many years. By the time you actually crack that, the data will probably no longer be relevant. So we're okay if you see it 2,000 years from now. But what if that could be cracked in 2 days as opposed to 2,000 years? Or even 30 days as opposed to 2,000 years? So the problem we're running into with some of the quantum computing is coherence, maintaining coherence for days on end, okay, months on end, so to run a formula for that long. If it's anything less than that, they've achieved coherence for multiple days on end in super cooled environments. So that's not a problem. But even if you're only going to run an algorithm for a full week, well, that's an entire week of no issues, minimal decoherence, not too many errors in the calculations. So it's still kind of the hardware versus the software, a little bit. So we have multiple algorithms, factoring those numbers, and we established earlier that the hardware is real. Okay, so where does that leave us today? How do you still stay protected? There are some recommendations, all right? From IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, you've got NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, you've got the Federal Information Processing Standards, FIPS, that's coming from the US government, all right? It's not just one body, okay? I know there's some back and forth, there's like RFCs versus NIST standards, so there's recommendations from all three of these groups about what we can use today that is still considered secure, even though quantum computing exists, okay? I've got these relevant RFCs, the NIST publications, the FIPS articles, the FIPS publications. These slides will also be posted online, so you can get a copy of that later. But the recommendations that all of these agree on, they come together in what's called the CNSA, the Commercial National Security Algorithm Suite. So these are the recommendations of what everyone should be using, and these are, today, these are okay for everything up to top secret information. So anything less than that, absolutely. For your encryption, we should be using still AES with at least a 256-bit key. You say, well, wait a minute, 256-bit key there, that's not huge, that's not a 1024-bit key. Right, but we're okay with that because AES as a cipher, as a block cipher encryption mechanism, it's not if you crack the key, that one key is used piece by piece by piece. The whole encryption is based off of what the previous block was ciphered with. So even just using a 256-bit key, we're okay with that. For the key exchange, we should be using Diffie-Hellman, okay, based off of the prime numbers, but we should be using elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman. Elliptical curve encryption mechanisms, just a short way to think about it, it adds mathematical complexity. All right? It's still the same underlying key algorithm, but by adding mathematical complexity, makes it harder to crack. So they recommend a curve, P384. It's a 384-bit curve in that elliptical curve calculations. For digital signatures, they recommend the elliptical curve, DSA, using that same 384-bit curve. Elliptical signatures are how we can sign, how we can certify the data being transmitted hasn't changed, who's transmitting it, who's receiving the traffic. And for hashing, again for verifying integrity, we're using SHA version 2, specifically with a 384-bit hash, all right, where the hash values are used to indicate the data hasn't changed in transit. Optionally, if you're going to use regular Diffie-Hellman, not elliptical curve, you're going to use regular Diffie-Hellman, you want to use at least a 3072-bit modulus, 3072-bit key size. That's pretty significant. That's several rounds of computation. All right, so that's going to add some latency to your calculations. That's why elliptical curve is preferred, because it's only a 384-bit curve. It's a little faster, but if you want to use regular Diffie-Hellman, that's fine. You can use 3072-bit modulus. And if you want to use RSA, key establishment, digital signatures, like when we talk about logging into a router remotely, you're pulling up a SSH session, command line, that's RSA. The minimum recommended is a 3072-bit modulus. Now, why am I stressing that one so much? When you default build RSA keys, you know what the default key size is? 512 bits. Only 512. That's crackable with classical computing these days. So minimum of 3072 is what's recommended. All right. So again, you can take a screenshot on these slides, or you can look up CNSA later. These are what we should be using. And when we start auditing, when we start looking at updating, make sure you're using at least these levels for encryption, key sharing, hashing. And these are still considered secure, even with the current state of quantum computing. Last part here. Quantum key distribution. As we move forward into this world of quantum computing, say, all right, quantum computers, those can crack your classical cryptography. Well, got that amazing hardware then, Why don't we just use it for the cryptography? Get some quantum cryptography. That's exactly what it sounds like. So quantum cryptography, called quantum key distribution. What we can do today, and it's in use by some banks, by some governments, not quite widespread. Again, there's still some money behind it, still a little expensive. They use single photons through fiber to signal ones and zeros, signaling encryption keys. It's actually, if anybody's familiar with TLS, your transport layer security, when you're talking out to a website, the negotiation of encryption transforms, the exchange of public and private keys, the calculation of a shared secret key on either side, the exchange of the secret key. It's very similar there. The idea is that they use single photons to transmit the data, the encrypted data and the encryption keys, and that any kind of eavesdropping can be immediately detected because it's a single photon. Again, remember the measurement of something changes its state. If you measure, if someone is viewing single photons being transmitted, that changes their receive state on the receiving device. So if there's any kind of tap, any kind of eavesdropping, at that moment, all the traffic is terminated, a rekeying takes place, and the new key is transmitted. And if the new key is listened in on, okay, if there's any disturbance there, then they key again until there's no eavesdropping, until the key can be transmitted securely. So kind of interesting, single photon transmissions, all right, using this quantum computing. And yeah, there's been transmissions of over 1,000 miles between, I think it was 2 banks who did that. It's just not great for large scale deployments. We're not using this across the internet yet. That'd be pretty great for guaranteeing security, guaranteeing privacy. But that is one method where they're using to secure some networks now. And then there's this whole new field, last part here, post-quantum cryptography. There's this idea that if our current cryptographic standards, the method of creating cryptographic keys, if the way those algorithms work are crackable or factorable by quantum computing, then change the formula. Don't create keys, don't use algorithms that function the same way as your current algorithms. Okay, so this is some theoretical inventing new realms of math, new algorithms for creating encryption keys, so that it's not a matter of just factoring to determine what the key is. So by changing the way encryption is done in the first place, quantum computing becomes irrelevant. I mean, it's not irrelevant, but it's irrelevant for that problem, where because it's a completely new algorithm, it's a completely new method of encryption, then you can look at that with a quantum computer, you look at it with a classical computer, doesn't matter until somebody like Peter Shor creates an algorithm for investigating it. So post-quantum cryptography, there are already researchers, developers looking into how do we stay secure moving forward. But let me just roll back here. I can't stress this enough. CNSA. Make sure that when you're doing your auditing, when you're doing your deployments, make sure you're using at least these standards, because as we established earlier, quantum computing exists. There's quantum hardware out there. Shor's algorithm has been run on quantum hardware, and not just the United States. We've got Russia, China, even Google is building quantum hardware. So we need to use these standards to maintain a level of safety on our devices, on our traffic. All right. Hopefully this has been interesting. I think it's fascinating. It's not just the realm of Star Trek anymore. I know I said it like 3 times, but it bears repeating.